Hello and welcome to our next episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. Now, today we are continuing our series that is examining the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution of China. If you had a chance to catch it, the first series of episodes was a discussion with Dr. Ping, where we looked at the history of the Cultural Revolution, the events that took place in China leading up to it, some of the political maneuvering that happened both preceding and as part of the Cultural Revolution, and then just kind of got a broad overview of how it reshaped the culture of China, and how it was a form of really kind of cutting off a lot of the old traditions, old customs, and was quite a turbulent time. So if you have not yet watched those episodes, definitely go back and check on that, because there's some fantastic documentary footage that is a part of that to give you a real sense of what it was like to live through that. Now that we've covered some of those basics, over the next few episodes, what we're going to do is try to get a little bit more personal with some of the stories of people who lived through it, to see how it affected the real lives of individuals within China, going through all of the political turmoil, all of the different ideological extremes that happened. And today is a particularly kind of difficult, painful story to watch. And it's exploring the question of how far can a ideology, whether it's political or social or what have you, how far can it go into changing your own perspective about people that are dear to you, people that you love? So much so that you may even cut off any of the family, filial love and affection that you have with them, and see them as so wrong, so inhuman, that you would call for their execution, even just because of things that they say that go against the ideology that you have. So what we are going to explore is a documentary that I was able to find about one particular story, where you can really only find it in Chinese media, not on YouTube or anything like that. I was able to locate it and get it translated, and we're going to watch it today. And so that we can have a bit of context and perspective, we've got Dr. Ping back to share his perspective on it. Let me add him in.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ping, how are you doing?
Good. How you doing?
I'm doing great. We had, I think, a really great conversation last time. I was so glad that you were able to go with us on that journey. And I think we're going to enjoy what we see today. If you've been following the channel, there's a brief newscast that kind of covers this story. And I guess maybe to set up how this story came to the world's awareness, I should bring up something that you might be familiar with, and that is that seems to be a movement now among people who were teenagers and Red Guards back in the Cultural Revolution to reflect on and even maybe apologize for some of the things that went on there. Is that a movement or a phenomenon that you're familiar with?
There was, I think it's about roughly 10 years ago. There are people who were Red Guard at that time and who have done some really bad things, and they came to regret and also trying to reflect what actually was happened. Because at that, when you are in, like, when you are young and in that kind of environment, and what they did, I mean, they don't consider it is wrong. To
Right.
them, it
At
was
the time.
at the time, but it's just like after years, they started to, first of all, they grew up, they understand more, and also China opened up, and the Chinese have access to the outside world, and especially the influence of Christianity, and
Hmm.
that the Christian ethics has kind of have people rethink about what happened.
Right. We live in such a connected world now where we're exposed to all different ways of thinking and different ideas. And it's very, very different from China, particularly at that point where they've come out from a very agricultural, long-standing tradition into, I think if anyone could say a positive aspect about Mao is he did drag them or bring them very violently and very rapidly into a more industrial age and a more connected age. but there was still this
Uh,
just closed off
what?
way of
Yeah, that actually was not true. That was kind of more the communist Chinese communist propaganda.
propaganda.
Yeah, because China was starting to modernize, and before the Chinese uh, Communist Party took over, and
Hmm.
now, for example, Shanghai was actually very westernized, even in the 1920s and 30s, and yeah, Shanghai as a city, the one of the early cities have electricity there in Asia. So things actually is China was modernizing. China
Hmm.
is getting, trying to recover from the war with Japan. And of course, if you listen to the Chinese government, the official narratives, then it's
Yep.
different story. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly. I think that in the various people that I've listened to that have tried to say, well, is there anything good about Mao? That's the one thing that they try to point to for it, because it's really hard to find positive things to say about Mao. It's kind of like people when they say, well, Hitler was a really good organizer and he really, advanced our industrial thing. It's like, well, if you have to find something positive to say, I guess you can go for that.
Well, I guess
One of the,
Hitler can
go
say
ahead.
that he basically well he started the project, right, infrastructure and all that, built the autobahn and all that. So there is something you can
Yeah.
point to, but Mao, I don't think there is anything good to point to.
Well, it's funny how even when you look through it through the propagandist lens, you always have to say yes, but at what cost? Was there
Hmm.
no other way to make these advances but at the cost of human life, human dignity, and all of the other things that happen? And that brings us to our story today, because we're going to see a little bit about that human life toll.
Right.
And so what I think we'll do is we'll just start this documentary and really dive into it. Now, it was originally posted where it's in, I think, Mandarin, and there's a little bit
Mm.
of translation. And it was quite a project to get an English translation of
Right.
it and then put that on the screen. But I was able to achieve it. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it in here. And what we'll do is we'll just start watching it. It does a pretty good job of setting up the story kind of in the middle of the action. And then you get to reflect and see how things got there.
Right.
And at any point, if you have something that you'd like to add to the narrative, then just let me know. Just speak up and I'll pause it and we'll
Okay.
go from there. Does that
Okay.
sound good?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. I'm going to add this to the stream and I will start it from the beginning.
1970年4月11日，安徽固镇县4里8乡的人们争相汇聚到县政府旁的空地上，赶着看一场盛况空前的万人宣判大会。人们拥挤着，踮脚翘首望向主席台，上面正跪着一个五花大绑、短发、白净的40多岁妇女。
我母亲被押来的时候是解放军押来的，全副武装，母亲挂着大木头牌子，是我亲眼看到的，上面写的是现行反革命犯方中谋，然后是红笔大叉，这个牌子就到了他的这个膝盖这儿，他就用自己的膝盖就猛然的往上顶。会场上人山人海呀，号称万人。到了主席台上，抓住他的头发，往下按，要向革命群众低头认罪嘛。母亲把脖子一梗，头一偏，又抬起来。
喧嚣的人群中，一个16岁的少年也远远地望着台上那个等待宣判的女人，那正是他的母亲。
不想见，不想再见了，想回避，回避不了，在左思右想，想再迈出这一步的时候，他勉强去了。
那个时候看到那么多人围着的跪在地上的那个人，你觉得是自己的妈妈？
是自己妈妈，不再是青面獠牙了，而是变成了一个人，一个我的妈妈。
1970年。
So just to reflect, I know it's going to be hard because you have to read the subtitles, but he was setting up this scenario where there was a public sentencing of a woman.
Right.
And they're describing kind of what we usually see in photographs of struggle sessions, where somebody is there with a sign with their crime hanging over their neck and their name with a big red X through their name. And in this case, it was a public hearing where everybody was gathered around, and the person who was being sentenced at that point was his mother. And he's a 16-year-old Red Guard in the crowd, seeing everybody condemn his mother, and they're abusing her on the stage forcefully, forcing her down. Was this type of justice commonplace in the Cultural Revolution? Because it seems very different from the normal court setting.
Well, actually, it was very common during the Cultural Revolution. Actually, it was common even before that. When the Chinese Communist Party took over China, they started this called land reform. So basically, they confiscated all the private land, and they were giving to the peasants, because that's one of the promise when they the communist Chinese Communist Party made a promise to the peasants. So that is very common back then, is to have such kind of it's not even a hearing. It's basically, it's already decided. So it's more kind of like a well, kind of like you are watching the cladded, well, the
A show
Roman,
trial.
the Roman,
the gladiators,
right, gladiator
in the Colosseum.
Yeah, it's sadly it's kind of a form of entertainment, and also a form of they call terror, the rat terror. So basically, all the landowners will get onto the stage, and then the sentence. Well, they will first of all will accuse people who are on the stage what things they did. Then they'll pass out the sentence, and normally it's execution right away. So that actually was starting to be very common very soon when the Chinese Communist Party took over. So when you get to the Cultural Revolution, so that kind of format is everybody was familiar with that format. It just become bigger. Like instead of like hundreds, thousands, sometimes you get tens of thousands.
I imagine that the crimes that people may be brought up for would change too. Whereas at first with the land reform movement, then it was all the landlord class. But then as we get into the Cultural Revolution, then they add multiple different classes of people, whether it's intellectuals or if you have a bloodline from the landlord, then that could also be used as justification for it.
Right. And the crime they have, which they can use that, apply that to anyone, is called counter-revolutionary. So nothing specific. So they can just brand you with that if they don't like you, or if you say something, especially in this case, if you dare to say something bad about Chairman Mao, then
and that
you
can
will
get
be
you branded as that.
Yeah, and that means death. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's keep going.
年4月11号，安徽省固镇县人头攒动，在这个罕有大事发生的非常偏僻的小县城里，这一天的盛况简直比节日还要。而在日后的县志里呢，这个日子也被大大的写上了一笔，因为这一天要公审一个女人。这个人曾经是固镇县县医院的一个医务人员，叫方中谋。1970年大年初8的深夜，方中谋呢被人从家里五花大绑的捆走了，随后以反革命罪被处以了极刑。他也是文革当中固镇县第一个被死刑处决的反革命。而在当地，这个案子引起了非常大的轰动，还有一个很特别的原因，正是方中谋的丈夫、儿子 把他推上了审判台，而且他们都非常坚决明确地向组织表示一定要枪毙方仲谋，这个青面獠牙的魔鬼。其中最为义正辞严、最坚决的，正是方仲谋的大儿子，那个远远观望了母亲最后一眼的16岁的少年张宏斌。
当宣读宣判结果的时候，整个万人会场安静了下来。16岁的张宏斌清晰地听到，判处死刑，立即执行。
当兵的把他拉上汽车，背后插着亡命旗，就是古代杀人的那种亡命旗，哎，上面一个红圈，押赴刑场。
刑场就在固镇县38河东岸，距离县城2公里。那里有一块荒野洼地，方仲谋困在行车上，人们追赶着、奔跑着跟在车后，生怕赶不上围观枪决的时刻。路上尘土飞扬，张宏斌脚步沉重地裹在人流里。
我真的没到刑场去看母亲被枪打死那个血淋淋的那个场面，我真的不忍心去看，我离得很远。
那时候怕跟他目光，
怕。
在母亲生命的终点，张宏斌内心涌动的复杂情绪难以言表。在宣判前，他始终认为母亲是个魔鬼，但生死时刻来临，少年的天性中一些尘封的本能情感又泛起心头。
有一天晚上
Now, before we get to the next part, it strikes me as it's describing the scene there, when you brought up the metaphor of the Roman Colosseum, where it was really a form of bloody entertainment to keep the mass occupied. It sounds like that, where you've got these thousands of people seeing this person being sentenced and then following them to see what is essentially a bloody execution. I don't know, is that, like, you get the sense from Roman Colosseums that was like the entertainment, blood and circus, or bread and circus type of stuff.
Right.
How common were these types of trials? Was it like a weekly thing? It may have depended on what province you were in.
Right. In any particular places, you would say maybe once a month, something like that. But it happened all over the country. So, yeah.
The other thing that strikes me is this is in 1970. And if we remember from our review of the timeline, the Cultural Revolution really kicked off in 1966. And
Right.
there's really a sense that it's really those first 2 years, 1966 to 1968, where there's most of the blood, most of the violence, and the chaos. But we can see here that this type of justice is still happening even 4 years into the Cultural Revolution.
Especially if you look at what happened, 66 started the Cultural Revolution, which and then 66 to 68 is basically the era for the Red Guards. So that the Red Guard can terrorize the country, and then they got into fighting with each other. So actually, at that time, the so-called 5 black classes, those people being left alone, because now it's between different fractions of Red Guards. So in order to be able to become Red Guards, you have to have a good, you belong to the good class, and so that I was about that time I was about 5, I think 4 or 5, and I still remember that we actually go watch how people fight, how they They started with
It's
sticks.
almost like military training.
Well, you see that. I mean, the first they started with the sticks, and then they started with steel rod, and so they can shapen one end, make that very sharp. And from that point, then from there they get into using guns. So eventually escalate even using like machine guns. So that was a very, very bloody period.
Yeah.
And
I
then
think in 1970, are we at the point where the military has been called in to kind of restore a form of
right,
order by
yeah,
1970?
right,
Okay. And I think
yeah,
we're going to see in this story where when they eventually turn her in, the military plays a role in that. And that's
right.
separate.
And
It's always good to remember that the Red Guard is not the military. The Red Guard are these ideologically driven,
right,
usually young people, but that's separate from the military who are in the hierarchy of
right. So basically,
Lin Biao.
Mao, after Mao used the Red Guards, and he sent those Red Guards to the countryside, to the rural area. And then the military took control the whole country. It's basically under martial law. And so from about 70s and 69, 70s, schools like elementary school, middle school, high school started to open up. And that's also from that times on, most crimes are counter-revolutionary type of
Okay.
crimes. Mm-hmm.
So that gives
And
us a good perspective for where this is taking place. Then it's not in
right,
those really early bloody years. It's when
no,
there's some semblance of order under the military, but there's still these counter-revolutionary crimes. And I don't think that the black classes ever really go away. They're still there, that can be invoked, even if
right,
it's not focused and run by the Red Guard.
right. And also, like back then, if you are one of the black classes, that means there's nothing you can do. So it's if your father, grandma or grandparents are one of the black landowners, and then on your dollar sale, and that you can see that's called
Yeah.
where you're from, and it's very clear.
Yeah.
So that means you are condemned. There's no political future for you. There is no
And so
even
keep that in
there's
mind.
no yeah.
While we're watching this, that factor, that blood element, where the bloodline that you come from, if it's already a bad class, will play a role in the family dynamics here. So let's go now. Now we've kind of seen now what happens. We've seen that this is leading to the death that they've depicted here. But he's going to go back now and he's going to reflect on, because there's that question of, was she your mother when you saw her on the stage? And he said, well, she was no longer the devil. And when did he see her as the devil is kind of a really important thing. But before he gets to that, he's going to kind of remind us what type of woman, what type of mother she was. And so that's where we are now.
是一个夏天，电闪雷鸣，我就跟妈妈说我害怕。那时候我3岁，母亲说：“孩子不用怕，我们把门关上，不要紧，让妈妈陪着你呢。”他就一边搓衣服，一边唱歌给我听，非常动听。北风那个吹，雪花那个飘，雪花那个飘飘，年来到，给我留下了非常深的印象。那真是一个温馨的夜晚。
从一个慈爱的母亲到一个青面獠牙的魔鬼，母亲忽然性情大变，而这一切的改变仅仅发生在一夜之间，一个诡异黑色的夜晚。 1970年2月13日，正月初8，这是张宏斌一生中最为刻骨铭心的一天。那天晚饭后，像往常一样，张宏斌刷碗，方中谋给丈夫和儿子洗着衣服。一家人对文化大革命开展家庭讨论和学习，但方中谋和丈夫张月生突然争执起来。
这时候，母亲在她的卧室里面拿起一本赤脚医生手册，上面印了毛泽东的这样一句话：高贵者最愚蠢，卑贱者最聪明。指的这一行字说，是别人说过的话，毛泽东引用的。哎，你这不是在贬低我们伟大领袖毛主席吗？毛主席语录怎么是别人的呢？我可能喊了他的名字，我说方中谋不能用语法问题来攻击伟大领袖毛主席。
16岁的张宏斌是大院里最积极的红卫兵之一。文革前小学还没毕业的张宏斌就加入了毛主席著作学习小组，对毛主席极为崇拜。当时母亲方中谋被当作特务嫌疑和地主阶级，被县医院隔离审查1年多了。为了纠正母亲的错误思想，张宏斌立即对她进行了批判。但那天晚上，一向从不爱与人争辩的母亲，言辞却越来越激烈。
但第一句话，我就是要为刘少奇翻案，这个可不得了，我就更对母亲不能容忍了。那就直接的把家里面的开始对文化大革命一些看法的辩论就变成了批斗会了，滔滔不绝，学的都是两报一刊社论里面那些话。大叛徒、大内奸、大公贼刘少奇都被关进大牢枪毙了，你还在为他翻案？到后来母亲又说出了一句让我们震惊万分的话：毛泽东为什么搞个人崇拜？到处都是他的像。这下就更不得了了，他把矛头直接指向了毛泽东。
话音一落，一家人惊骇万分。攻击污蔑伟大领袖，这样的反动行为足以招来最严酷的惩罚。
经常看到墙壁上张贴的枪毙人的公告，污蔑攻击毛主席并副主席，判处死刑，立即执行。布告中间是像那个用那个粗大的毛笔蘸上红色的墨水，大大的一个鸿沟。
深夜的张家小院就像是惊涛骇浪里的船只，巨大的恐惧击中了方中谋的亲人们。他们熟悉的方中谋是一个优秀党员，政治上更是一贯正确，而这个一晚，这个女人却令他们格外陌生。
这个时候，在面前的这个人
不是母亲了，她已经变成了一个现行反革命，变成了一个阶级敌人了。
就因为那2句话，
对，简直是青面獠牙的魔鬼，瞪着血盆大口，就那一刻。
这非常老的毛泽东选集了。
就解放后的大概是第1版，他写的学习为人民服务的心得笔记。
在母亲被枪决后的多年里，为什么那一晚他的性情大变，始终是张宏斌心里的谜团。因为在此之前，母亲留给张宏斌的印象一直都是一个兢兢业业的医务工作者和一个虔诚的革命者。
All right, before we go into the history of his mom, I guess, did it make sense to you that they reacted like that with her saying what she did?
Oh, yeah. I mean, at that time, Mao basically became a god. So anything you say, I mean, even you say Mao can live up to 100 years, and you couldn't get in trouble for saying that. Because
it wasn't
how dare you, right? How dare you
put a limit on his lifespan.
right. Well, because we are saying like long live Chen Mao, and the Chinese word for long live Chen Mao is 10,000 plus 10,000 years.
Mm.
Okay, so that was how the emperors in the past, that's how people call emperors. So he basically became uh, uh, the emperor of China. That yeah, after he
Even
actually
while coming to power, probably denigrating the idea of an emperor. We need no emperors. We need a government for the people.
right. Well, the thing is,
We're gonna have an emperor.
before the Cultural Revolution, Mao is the first of the equal. So if you look before the newspapers in the 50s and all that, when you see the portrait, it's not just Mao's portrait. There is Zhou Enlai's portrait and Liu Shaoqi's portrait. And I mean, those people, those are the
Right.
the top guys, and he just the first of the equals. But once he get rid of Liu Shaoqi, he became the emperor, and everybody is below him. Yeah.
And all of them were kind of comrades in arms. They had all fought, in the ragtag Communist Party that eventually won the wars. They all went through the long march northward and survived that, which kind of bound them together at the time. But then when it came to jostling for power and for claiming and holding real power, everybody else was expendable. And that's kind of brought out in the Liu Shaoqi issue here, where they're saying, are you reversing the verdict on Liu Shaoqi?
Right.
Where, once Mao declared him to be an enemy of the people, an enemy, then if you were to go against Mao's prior verdict that took him out of power, well, then you're now speaking out against, against Mao, against the people, and you've got wrongthink, which apparently carried the death penalty, as we're seeing.
All right, right. And also, like, talk about, in the document, talk about the, his mom was a PS revolutionary. So, and one thing I guess not that many people know is that during the Cultural Revolution, many real communists were killed, because as a real Marxist or real communist, you know that that's not. I mean, you're not supposed to have uh, uh, you're not supposed to have personal worship, right? I mean, the communism is supposed to have everybody's equal, and there is no class. And now you have someone got elevated into the status of a god. That's against everything about communism.
But if he says, I stand for the people, and so I represent the people, then if you speak out against me, you're speaking out against the people, then it kind of sort of makes sense. But it all ends up being, like George Orwell so eloquently put it, everybody's equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And we're seeing that reflected in it. All right, well, let's keep going. And that point we made where she was a pious, Communist Party member is absolutely true. And we're going to learn that, even people who are among the most ideologically driven may eventually have a change of heart, a change of mind, and decide that the direction that they're going in isn't right. But then when you're in that totalizing system, when you try to step out of line, then the system will come crashing down on you, even if you were part of the system beforehand.
Right.
And unfortunately,
that's basically what the Red Guards. When the Red Guards, I mean, those are people who actually worship Mao, and because they're how to say, I mean, they are young, right? Just like young people, wants to worship, Beatles or whatever, maybe the Rolling Stone. I mean, they have those energy and the zeal, and but in that kind of time, they become people are afraid of them. The old, especially the old people are afraid of them. Old people know something is wrong.
But they can't say anything about it
They
because
cannot
then
say
they'll be
anything.
caught in its
Right.
trap. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like you're afraid.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and of these young people who part of the youth is you still have a sense of black and white thinking where everything is either all good or all bad, and it's hard early in your life to have the nuance and the sophistication to kind of see that things aren't all good or all bad. And so that kind of makes sense where his mother flips suddenly from this good revolutionary to a demon. It's either all good or all bad just by the act of her saying something against Mao.
Right.
Or something against the ideology. So, all right, well, let's keep going because I want to make sure that we cover all of this in time. And so now we're going to go into a little bit of her story, her backstory.
1949年，23岁的方中谋追随中共地下党父亲方学吾参加了革命。他加入共产党军队，任卫生员、护士，参加了渡江战役，荣获过1次3等功和2次劳模。国共内战结束后，方中谋和一个名叫张月生的解放军干部相识恋爱。然而在此期间，方中谋的地下党父亲却被当作地主阶级和匪特分子，在土改中被镇压。但这并未影响到方中谋的前程。当年他和张月生双双转业，丈夫任苏州市卫生科科长，方中谋任宿县专属医院护士长，后任护理部副主任。1956年还被评为安徽省建设社会主义积极分子。
一位农村的产妇失血过多，生命垂危，他给病人这位产妇献血，还回到家里面给这位产妇打鸡蛋下面条送去。一位小男孩得了白喉，一种烈性传染病。由于这个喉咙被痰堵住，眼看生命危险，那为了救这个孩子，口对口的把这个病孩的痰吸出来，救了这个孩子。
婚后，方中谋和张月生先后养育了儿女3人，张宏斌排行老2，还有一个姐姐和一个弟弟。儿时的张宏斌并不叫这个名字，而是叫张铁夫。在他童年的记忆里，父母感情和睦，母亲非常疼爱他们，那是他一生中最幸福的时光。
当年发高烧的时候，晚上母亲来摸摸我的头脑，还热不热，用这个酒精擦这个头，擦手掌，擦腋窝，给我物理降温。父亲呢也是，用他温暖的大手来摸。父亲从北京回来，给我买了一辆北京的公交车模型，下面半截是红颜色，上面半截黄颜色。哎呀，可高兴了！我们姊妹3个人，县政府大礼堂那个台阶上面，很长很长的台阶，我们在上面开车，然后在那个草地去摘野花。
1966年，文革爆发，张铁夫那年小学毕业。8月18日，毛泽东在天安门城楼检阅100万红卫兵。北京一位女中学生宋彬彬作为红卫兵代表，得到了毛泽东的接见。
北京师大女附中的红卫兵宋彬彬给毛主席戴上了红卫兵的袖章。毛主席问他叫什么名字，他说叫宋彬彬。毛主席问是不是文质彬彬的彬，他说是。毛主席说要武嘛。
2天后，这段对话以“我给毛主席戴上红袖章”为标题，登载在《人民日报》上，署名为宋耀武。
改名了，我看到以后特兴奋，我也得给自己改名啊。什么最好呢？我就叫红兵，
最直接、最响亮的名字。
我的姐姐改名，她也是她自己改的啊，她叫张代红，就是一代一代的要继承革命的传统，代代红。
咱们这一改名可不得了，影响了我们这整个学毛主小队的孩子们。
从此，张铁夫变成了张红兵，他也从喜欢小汽车的烂漫儿童，变成了有志于革命的红小兵。一开始，对于儿女的进步热情，方仲谋夫妇都非常支持。
我们家那个堂屋的正面墙上，是毛泽东主席和刘少奇主席2位领导人的画像并排贴在一起。父亲就给我说，你搬个凳子上去，把那张像，他指着刘少奇，把它取下来，然后把毛泽东的画像再给它挪到中间。我到了新华书店去，买了好多毛泽东诗词的手记，像中山风雨起苍黄啦，5、6张贴到他们墙上，他们都很高兴啊。
红色的风暴很快从北京刮到了小县城，当它真正降临到每个人头上时，却一点也不浪漫。父亲张月生首当其冲被打倒。作为固镇县卫生系统头号资产阶级当权派，他被戴上高帽游行批斗。随后在大字报中，张红兵又第一次看到外公1951年被当作地主和特务镇压的事儿。一直自认为是革命干部子弟的张红兵，陷入了前所未有的失落和痛苦中。没过多久，大院里又多了一张批判张月生的大字报，署名的竟然是张红兵。
我用木头自己刻了一把长枪，父亲看到了以后，他不高兴的，老子在部队玩枪都玩够了，你还玩枪，不由分说。那我哭着闹着要着，他把枪拿过去，把他取了。
这个时候这个事儿成了罪证了。
但我给他上纲上线。毛主席说：“枪杆子里面出政权。”
你把我的枪给折了。
你把我的枪折了。
I think it's important to point out here that what we're seeing is, as a Red Guard, as a youth, he knows that he has power over his father. Because, when his father says, I've had enough with guns in the military, I don't want you playing with guns, and he's got this toy wooden gun that has symbolic meaning because it's a physical manifestation of Mao's saying that political power comes out of the barrel of a gun and trying to raise people up with that idea. Then when his father breaks it, he now has ammunition to weaponize in the form of a Daisybao, these big character posters. And so that moment where they said that, in the courtyard where all of these big character posters were, even as his father is already being struggled against, a new paper comes up that has his signature on it where he's denouncing his father as a Red Guard member.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he mentioned something called 上纲上线, Chinese. It just means that you don't look at an incident as an isolated incident. You're trying to make that into something more. Like in this case, his father probably upset or something, and so broke his wooden gun, and that's it. There's nothing more than that. But what he did is to say, okay, Chairman Mao said this, and you break my gun, so therefore you are against Chairman Mao. So that's a typical example called the 上纲上线. It's something you really that didn't ever mean to do it or have never even thought of, but some people can make that a lot bigger. And this is actually something in some sense, that's what we see a little bit in America right now, is trying to make something, blow something out of proportion.
What is the direct translation of that saying?
It's that will be, it's kind of hard. It's kind of raised up to certain level.
Okay. I see that, like where you're mentioning, where we have some similar phenomenons out there. I think people have called this problematizing, where you take something regardless of the intention, regardless of the complexities of the system. If you can bring out some ideological principle and make an argument that it violates it, then you can condemn whatever person or whatever idea, whatever movie, whatever book, whatever posting. You can condemn it by pointing out its problematics according to a particular ideology. And it's the same sort of thing. Then you can, get someone canceled or have people turn against it.
Like, for example, if I go to a store and maybe the store clerk was not happy that day, right? And so she might say something not,
incourteous, impolite or something.
It's kind of impolite, or even less than impolite. But I can make that into a big case because if she's, well, let's say if it's not a woman, it's a man, it's a white man. Okay, so now I'm a Asian man, and so therefore that's a racism. That is kind of trick people did during the Cultural Revolution. Is like, say, if I had some grudge against you, right, in the past, and now it's perfect time because I can something you did, I can blow up out of proportion and say, actually, you are against Chairman Mao. So therefore, I can, I can whatever, I can cause
condemn
trouble.
You or right, exactly. And that kind of goes into that, what we talked about at the end of our Cultural Revolution review, where it erodes the social trust and the social cohesion that happens because everybody is, anxious that they might be condemned in such a way when intention doesn't matter and all you have to do is make an accusation, frame it in a particular way, and then it's as good as true, then, there's no way for a society to really survive that.
And another very evil thing the government did, the Chinese government did, is the quota system. Is that every factory or every commune, every unit, you need to have certain number of bad people, even though there's no bad people there, right? But there's a quota system. Let's say 5%. Now, you have a unit of 100 people. 5 has to be a bad guy. So who are those 5 guys? You have to look for it.
I've never heard of this. Really? Yeah. So there was a quota. There had to be so many black class people.
Well, not a black class people. It's remember that was the time you can be accused as a counter revolutionary, So, and that's where the Sanggang Shengxian can become such a bizarre kind of to totally blow out the proportion because you have to fill the quota.
Wow. Okay, well, let's keep going because this is getting interesting here.
I'll just give you kind of.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just give a kind of an antidote on that one. It's actually this happens quite often before the Cultural Revolution. That's when there are anti-rightist movement, like all the intellectuals. So they also have quota. So now let's say we are in this. We're working together as a unit, and we have decided who has to be the the 4 guy, right? And so you have a meeting, and nobody can decide which one. And then you decide to go to the bathroom, and once you come back, you are the bad guy.
You're the bad guy.
It's kind of sad, but it's quite common.
Yeah, it's like they put up a system of perverse incentives that causes people to constantly be fighting and denigrating each other.
Right.
And it's no wonder that things turned out so badly at that particular time. Okay, let's keep going.
父亲张月生也看到了，却并没有责备张宏斌，反而对儿子客气了起来。
There's that fear.
他说自己只读了3年书， 理论水平不高，常常请读过小学的儿子帮忙分析自己到底犯了什么错误，甚至写检查通不过的时候，还让张红兵代笔。可是大院里的一些老邻居，再见到这个检举父亲的少年时，眼神则变得复杂起来。
所以你父亲丝毫没有对你会觉得心寒呢？这孩子怎么写我的大字报？
没有，这是社会的大潮流，都是这么做。我觉得他反而，他把我当做一个平等的对象来对待了。我贴出大字报以后，得到了他们造反派的认可。
得到他们认可很重要吗？
很重要，因为我和他们是一样的，我也是革命者。
张月生被批斗期间，方中谋作为走资当权派的臭老婆，也经常被拉去陪斗。13岁的张红兵则站在台下看着父母挨斗。
父亲在这个会场中间跪着，向革命群众低头认罪，跪，让母亲下跪，他坚决不跪，别人就拳打脚踢父亲，那么母亲呢，那就用手挡，护着父亲。
张月生曾在抗日战争中被炸弹炸伤了腿，挨完批斗，双腿早已失去知觉。方中谋默默地陪着丈夫，在夜色中蹒跚着走回家。
我的印象最深，就是从我记事，也从来没有看过父亲和母亲这样走在一起亲密过。他们没有搀手，没有手拉手，但是呢，他们走得很近，几乎是肩膀靠肩膀。
就是反倒是在这个时候，两个人并肩走来，给你留下了特别深刻。
是的，我现在想起来还历历在目。他回家以后就觉得自己的肾脏部分疼痛，然后就尿血了，父亲开始流眼泪了。母亲呢就在旁边安慰他，说：“你要想开一点，你算什么呀？彭德怀元帅那么大的功劳，不也是被打成有心机会主义分子吗？就从家里面找来一块布，找来一些棉花，一针一线从那个厚厚的2只护膝，在罚跪的时候垫上，可能好受一些。”
You really get a sense from those stories where she's drug up to the podium to be struggled against with her husband, and she refuses to bow down. But then when the crowd starts hitting her husband, she raises her arms and puts herself between the crowd and her husband to defend him. And then walks home with them. And then, while he's, despairing, she comforts him and even goes so far as to sew him special knee pads that he can use for when he's being struggled against. Because this happened to him, I think that they said something like 20 times or something. So you really get a sense of her character in that she's both loving as a mother and as a husband. And even though she's a party member, she's still got quite a spine to her. And she still has a sense of personal dignity that she stands up for herself.
Right.
All right, let's keep going.
又经历了20多次大大小小的批斗，文革开始快2年的时候，张月生终于被解放了出来。可是还没有从残酷的斗争当中喘口气儿，1个月之后，方仲谋受他的父亲的牵连，又被当作地主分子和特务嫌疑，在县医院受到隔离审查。他一直向组织申诉，父亲当年镇反是被冤枉的，要求撤销政治牵连，可是没有被理睬。1年多的时间里，方仲谋一直被关在医院里，不许回家，饭由孩子们送来，每天一早一晚。方仲谋呢都要站在医院门前的大路边低头请罪，其余的时间就是在扫厕所、消毒，双脚胀得连鞋都穿不下。1年之后，组织上终于允许方仲谋晚上回家。可是这一次母亲回来，家人都觉得好像他变得有点怪异、沉默，时常发呆，而且经常根本就忘了吃饭，就去上班了。1970年2月13号，在张红兵事后的记忆当中，这天一开始 就带着诡异不祥的气息。
Okay, so we've got first the story of the father being struggled against, and it's useful to just go back and reflect on the reason he was being struggled against is he was an administrator in the hospital. And if you remember that Barefoot Doctor manual where they read the cover of it said that the elite are ignorant and it's really the lowly people who have all the knowledge, there was this strong sentiment that intellectuals, people who held positions of privilege, authority, and power in any of these bureaucratic institutions, they were the bad class because they had that privilege and they thought they were better than people. So there's multiple stories.
Right.
Go ahead.
And there is a reason for that because Mao basically, when the Cultural Revolution started, he was marginalized. So Liu Shaoqi actually controlled the whole party hierarchy. And so the first thing when Mao used the Red Guards to turn the country upside down, the first thing he did is basically is to turn the whole power hierarchy upside down. And so anyone in any position of power during that time, they are all being criticized against.
And it fits perfectly with Marxist-Leninist ideology that Mao Zedong thought was built on, where you divide into the haves and the have-nots based on class or whatever, and then foment conflict on that type of division. And it just works on this line in terms of the intellectuals or the administrators and everybody else or the party elite. So that's why his father was being struggled against. And then finally they say, okay, they're letting go of that struggle. But now his mother, now it hints to this a little bit, but there's some background to his mother in that his mother's father was classified as a landlord. It doesn't cover it in this documentary, but there's other articles that go a little bit more in depth. She was originally in an arranged marriage with another family, and she broke off that arranged marriage in order to marry her husband. In this documentary, and the father of the person she was engaged to marry killed himself in shame or as a result of her basically abandoning that arranged marriage. And so the father came into a position of power in the Communist Party after they took control, and he went in, and even though technically her father would not have been classified as a landlord, he made sure he was classified as a landlord and then subsequently executed in the land reform movement. And then this now categorized her as the landlord class because she was a child.
In the documentary, it talked about her dad was underground party member. Do you know what that? Do you know what that is? Underground party member. So basically, you are you working for at that time before the 1949, you work for the nationalist government.
I see.
But actually, you are secretly the communists. You are the spies, and so that's called underground party member. And so many of those actually were persecuted, especially during the Cultural Revolution, because it's very hard to explain. Right? You were the bad guys, right? Even though you are secret,
you were in the system of the
right. Even though you are,
or whatever it was.
Even though you are the secret, party member, but you're working for the Kuomintang, the nationalist government, and a lot of times the things are very secret. So it's only you only have, they call it the you own just one person as your kind of like what they trying to call
your connection with the Communist Party underground.
Yeah, you have one. What happens if that person died? Then there's no way for you to explain that you are really a Communist Party, even though you did everything. You spied for the Communist Party. But once the Communist Party took power, they don't care, right? They don't care.
You're now a source of distrust. It's like, well, we can't trust you, and so that can be used to demonize you as well.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks for explaining that, because that gives some perspective and background there. All right, let's keep going.
那天早上，方仲谋起来，还是没有吃早饭就去上班了。张月生不放心妻子，让张宏斌和弟弟去给母亲送饭。
我和弟弟这么劝他，他都不吃饭。他让我干了一件事儿。他说：“小铁夫，抽屉里面放了那么多青霉素的药瓶，上面字有红色的字体，有蓝色的字体，你给我摆出‘共产党万岁’5个字，红的多，蓝的少。我就把红字屏摆了‘共产党’3个字，蓝色的字的屏摆了‘万岁’2个字。反正这个我觉得心里面挺那个的，我就不舒服。
不安的兄弟俩一整天都陪着母亲，直到傍晚下班。晚饭后，在全家人学习讨论文革形势的时候，父母突然争执起来，
简直像炸了一样啊！谁想到能够从他的嘴里面说出来？他说这样2句话：“万岁已经改变颜色了。”就是我在县医院化验室桌上面用小瓶摆的那个字“万岁”2个字。
恰好你是拿蓝色摆的。
对，文革当中喊的最多的口号是什么？毛主席万岁，万岁万万岁。所以他说，万岁已经改变颜色了，共产党还是同的。他还相信共产党，但是他不相信毛泽东一个人。
张宏斌原本还同情母亲被外公牵连，但此刻他竟然怀疑起自己崇拜如神的伟大领袖。这个忠诚的红小兵愤怒了。
我手端着一个刷碗的一个大黄盆，陶瓷的，我就说：“你再敢放毒，我就用盆砸烂你的狗头。”母亲也非常气愤，她把眼一瞪：“你敢？你再说，我把家里面的像要通通的撕毁砸碎。”
方仲谋的话越说越离谱，已经惊呆了的丈夫张月生吓得再也听不下去了。
方仲谋，从现在起，你就是阶级敌人，我们要和你划清界限。你把你刚才说的话，你都给我写出来。母亲呢，坐在藤椅上，拿起父亲的香烟盒，抽出一支烟，点燃了，抽起来。从小到那天晚上，我都没见过母亲抽烟，但是那天晚上，她破例的抽起香烟来了。她一边抽烟，她说：“那还不好写吗？我敢说，敢想，敢干。因为我是实践过来的。”
张月生当即决定向军代表揭发方仲谋的反革命行径。
父亲临走的时候还交代：“你们在家看好他，别让他跑了。”
他怎么会这么决绝呢？这毕竟是他的妻子。
对。
母亲曾经给他患难与共。
对。
给他缝补膝，搀扶他回来。
是的。
他没有想到这些。
具体父亲怎么想，现在无从知道。
张宏斌仍然不放心，他怕父亲还处于旧思想，留恋夫妻之情，不是真的去举报，于是自己又匆匆写了一封检举信，并包上平日佩戴的红卫兵胸章。他也走出家门，把信塞进了县群众专政指挥部军代表的宿舍门缝里。
意识到你写的这个结果是什么？
就是向军代表报案，把母亲抓起来。
实际上在此刻之前，你还是很心疼他的，每天给他送饭，你们
一直怕他出事。
怎么会这么惨？
就是这么大。从幼儿园到小学，所受到的教育，他就是爹亲娘亲不如毛主席亲。谁要是反对他，谁就是我们的敌人。
这个时候，你在面前的这个人，
他变成了魔鬼，在我的眼里是阶级敌人。我对他心里面没有那种母子的依恋的感情啊。
就因为那2句话。
对。
一夜之间，慈爱的母亲忽然变得癫狂。
墙上的一张毛泽东的画像都被母亲点火烧掉了。
父子2人联手举报，将亲人亲手送上刑场。
那个军代表排长对着母亲呢。
一夜之间，慈爱的母亲忽然变得癫狂。
墙上的一张毛泽东的画像都被母亲点火烧掉了。
父子2人联手举报，将亲人亲手送上刑场。
Jonathan, I cannot hear you.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to pause it here. This comic shows up in other articles, but this is the only place you can see the image from it.
Right.
I don't know if you're able to read any of the words on the side, but what we're told in the context in other articles is that after the execution, he was held up as a model Red Guard person because he put Mao before family and turned in his family for speaking out against Mao. And so they made this cartoon depiction of him denouncing his mother and then his mother being executed. In this case, in the lower right-hand corner, they depict her with a bayonet piercing the back of her head, coming out of her mouth with her, you can see the sign hanging around her neck there. But that glorification of his act didn't actually last terribly long, because very shortly after that, then the consequence of her being classified as a counter-revolutionary, where he was now the son of a counter-revolutionary, came into play. And so both he and his father had consequences as a result of that.
Right.
Okay.
那个军代表排长对着母亲的脚腕一脚，母亲扑通一下跪了下去，捆那个粽子一样。我听到了母亲的肩关节发出咔咔的声音。
血色烟尘已散，数十年后，母亲的秘密却再次揭开尘封的伤疤。
这条路往前去，那个。
Okay, so that first part there was kind of the introduction, and you can see they're revisiting that night, giving a little bit more detail each of those times. At first, it was that the son had condemned them, and in the second telling, now that you have more of a sense of the relationship between the mother and the father and the trials the father had previously been put through, then you can understand how significant it was that his father also condemned his mother, who had stood by his side in the middle of those other struggle sessions. And the question of what was his father thinking? And he mentions that his dad left and said, keep her here, and I'm going to go turn her in. And he is thinking, well, he might still love my mom and not turn her in. So I'm going to make a separate report that also includes my father, that he's supposed to turn him in. So if he doesn't turn her in, then he too will be condemned. And he's doing this in the righteous fervor of, his identity as a Red Guard and in the ideology of Mao. And at that time, he thinks it is the most righteous thing that he can do. He has to do it. If he doesn't do it, he's complicit in systems of oppression that, work against the people. And that's that mindset that causes him to dehumanize her, so that he's no longer looking at his loving mother. He's looking at a demon. And by dehumanizing her, he can justify in his mind to himself, in his own psychology, what he is doing that he knows will lead to her execution, because there's other examples they mentioned with the signs with the red check marks. And he, in his report, he specifically says she should be executed.
Right.
And, when he's talking about his mother now as a 60-year-old lawyer, you can only imagine the type of torment that he's endured, coming to mature later on and realize that all of those actions were wrong.
Right. And especially, like you said, only after a couple of years, he was, he also was, how to say that, affected because his mom was a counter-revolutionary. And sometimes those, if he just became a hero and get into some kind of power, then the story could be different.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Because a lot of times when you get into the trial yourself, then you start to reflect and trying to think, and trying to become, sorry for what you have done in the past. Right.
That's a good point. Anything else on that before we get to the next part?
And they can see that. They can see the consequence of the education, the leading up to that. Because once the Chinese Communist Party took over, they outlawed all private education. So education is basically run by the government. I mean, it sounds nice,
free school.
In the surface, free school, right? Free education. Everybody is equal. Everybody can get educated. It doesn't matter you're rich or poor. Everybody get educated. But because that the government was able to brainwash those kids, so that kind of set the stage later on. Like when he actually talked about it. When he was in school, he said that Chairman Mao is more dear than your own parents,
mother and father.
Mother and father. So Mao became this how to say?
He's like a supreme figure.
Yeah, and
in their life.
In a way, I mean, if you want to compare with Christianity, Mao kind of become God the Father. He also had this father figure there, and so people worship as a God, but also worship him in a way in terms of the relationship is between children and the father.
Wow.
Kind of like the great father, right? The great father. And so that's why to him, when his mom said something against Mao, that actually made him turn against his own mother.
That allegiance that you would normally have to your own parents is directed towards Mao instead of to your actual parents, and so it allows you to betray your parents, because that betrayal is really an allegiance to Mao. Right. Yeah. Which makes sense only so long as you hold that way of thinking, and certainly later on you see it as something totally different. Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's move on. Now we're going to see a little bit of this area, what it looks like now, and in doing so, reflect a little bit on what happened back then. Mm-hmm. So let's keep going.
栅栏门，那就是现在的固镇县委县政府公审我母亲的大会，也就是在这个操场召开的。
我在这个里面。
对，他这个就是当时那个会场，当时一片广场黄泥地。这个广场里面站全部都是人，哎，特别是那个囚车押来、行车押来的时候，大家都想看。我应该是从人群里面挤到主席台的左前方，有个10米远左右的地方，看到了母亲。
母亲看到你了吗？
她没有看到我，也不会想到我会来看她。
什么心情？跟着这行车，一步步的走向你母亲的生命的终点，
难以形容，不是一句话能够说完的。
有恐惧、无奈，有要坚持，
只知道跟着走。
对对，走到刑场，但我绝不去看血淋淋的那一幕，我绝不看。
为什么？
本能的拒绝。
是一种本能。
是的。
张宏斌今年63岁，安徽蚌埠固镇县人。40多年以来呢，他总是会做同一件事，就是一次又一次的回到故乡的一座大院当中，回到和这个大院相连的那条道路上。虽然如今这里已经变成热闹的街市了，可是在张宏斌的眼里，这里却永远无法褪去苍茫的血色。1970年4月11号的时候，这个大院里人山人海。那一天，他的母亲在这里被公审，以反革命罪被判处死刑，而且押赴郊区的刑场立即执行。如今46年过去了，当年这起震动全县的案件已经在历史的烟尘当中淹没了。可是张宏斌的记忆却无法停止的一次又一次的回望母亲生命最后走过的这段死亡之路。这不足2公里的公审大会到刑场之间的这个道路，张宏斌走了无数次。他要找寻那个戛然消逝的谜一样的母亲。
这座房子呢，就是我家的旧居，一共是3间房子。这房子还没变，还是原来那样。不过过去那是个窗户。
15岁之前，张宏斌和父母一直生活在这里。他留下了张宏斌人生中最美好的回忆，也见证了他最刻骨铭心的一页。文革爆发后，母亲方中某受土改中被当作地主分子和匪特分子镇压的父亲牵连，在县医院里限制自由，隔离审查1年多。1970年2月13日夜里，一家人在探讨文化大革命时，母亲方中谋突然言辞激烈地抨击领袖，行为异常癫狂。
墙上的一张毛泽东的画像，还有毛主席诗词手记，都被母亲取出来撕下来，点火烧掉了。这时候父亲就更气愤了，大反革命分子。他对我说，我手里拿着擀面杖，我心里面一惊，怎么能对母亲不忍心啊？我的后背上颤。
都是你当时自己潜意识里的。
是，我说其实是潜意识，我浑身在颤抖，我的上牙和下牙嘚不由自主的。
但是他什么表情？
他高喊“共产党万岁”。
方中谋的反动行为让一家人惊骇不已。当时大儿子张宏斌是一个狂热而忠诚的红卫兵，坚决不能容忍母亲侮辱伟大领袖。他和父亲张月生当即决定揭发方中谋。在长长的揭发材料的结尾，张宏斌和父亲都写上了枪毙方中谋的字样。同日，张月生写了离婚申请和代表儿子脱离母子关系的申请。方中谋毫不犹豫签上了同意。
变成了一个简直是青面獠牙的魔鬼，不是人了。
他说别是我妈妈了。
对，更不是我妈妈和我爱人了，反而有一种解脱。我终于甩开历史反革命地主成分这个包袱了，哎，我还回到贫下中农这一边。这个阶级成分真是太了不得了，阶级斗争是你死我活的。我只想他是阶级敌人，我应该划清界限。
其实这种人之常情的儿女情长的东西，已经都
不存在了，都不存在了，烟消云散。
因为大义灭亲，张宏斌呢被树立为了革命典型，在母亲的批判大会上做演讲。还有人根据张宏斌的革命事迹呢创作了漫画，在固镇县的革命展览馆里进行展出。张家人表现得如此的决绝，这个小县城里很多百姓对他们出卖亲人的这种行为，其实暗地里也是指指戳戳。有人认为张月生肯定是在外面有了女人， 风言风语多了，张宏斌心里呢也就有了一定的自我怀疑。难道我真的做错了吗？自我怀疑之际，他又会为自己的革命意志不坚定呢而感到羞愧。就在这样的反复的摇摆当中，法院下达的离婚证书和死刑判决书同一天寄到了张家。
1970年4月11日，在枪毙方中谋之前，固镇县召开了万人宣判大会。在汹涌的人潮中，时年16岁的张宏斌也夹杂其中。
从我的精神状态来说，已经濒临崩溃的边缘，头发懵、晕、嗡嗡叫。当时我甚至连走路都迈不出脚步了。
看到那么多人围着的跪在地上，你觉得是自己的吗？
是自己吗？但是我逃避不了啊，不再是青面獠牙，而是变成了一个人，一个我的妈妈。我的心在颤抖。
那天枪决的只有你母亲一个吗？
只有他一个人。对，他当时的那个会场的那个新车出来应该是在这个位置，在这边这个位置，跟着新车走就走这条路，新车在前面开，后边的人在追新车，想尽量的追上，想去看这个行刑的场面。我跟着这个大队的人马在中间，当年都是砂石路，
现在根本都看不出来了。
对，
这么繁华的一个地方，
完全和面貌改变了。
方中谋死后，张方两家也彻底断绝了往来。方中谋娘家遭到了冲击，二妹忧愤而亡，而张家也并未因大义灭亲得到眷顾。反革命家属的政治帽子如影随形，像一座无形的大山压制着他们。张宏斌兄弟二人初中毕业后，没有获得进厂升学或当兵的机会，被安排下乡插队劳动。张月生则又在大小运动中经历2次癌症和被免职，日子过得战战兢兢。1976年，10年动荡岁月结束。之后的2年，极左思潮统治的年代结束，对于文革的反思批判逐渐蔚然成风。
All right, so before we get to the period of reflection, it's interesting when they go back and revisit the moment of their execution. Now that we have more of an understanding of what led to that time, you can kind of sense his helplessness where he sees his mother up on the podium. She's no longer a devil. He reconnects with her as a human and as his mother, but she's surrounded by all of these people calling for her execution, and he no longer has the power to save her.
Right.
And, you know, what do you do in that moment when you're surrounded by these forces that you set into motion, but you cannot undo? It's got to be, you know, so tormenting to him to reflect on.
Yeah.
I think that's what's really painful about listening to this is him realizing that all of these things are because he turned on his mother that way.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, with the help of his father, even.
Mm-hmm.
And they mentioned there that his, you know, the honor of placing loyalty above family did not last long, and it didn't protect him from being a family member of counter-revolutionary. And that took away opportunities for him. He couldn't go to school. He couldn't join the military. He was forced to go to the countryside and work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so we're about to see now, after those turbulent years of the Cultural Revolution die down and things loosen up and you're able to reflect and perhaps criticize a little bit more. They mentioned that there was a divide between the family. And what that is that his mother's sister and brother saw who it was that sent their sister to her death, and they blamed the father and the son for it. Mm-hmm. And so you can see that would certainly create a rift in the family. And that is something that it's reflected even when he came out with his story. One of the reporters went to visit and interview him, and he took them to the brother of his mother. And it was a very difficult interview. You can appreciate from the words of it. And I'll put a link to that article in the show notes. Okay, so let's continue.
而此时已经成为一个青年钳工的张宏斌，却忧心忡忡，备受折磨，
陷入了一种极度抑郁的状态。最后到什么地步？在家里面和父亲和弟弟无法用语言交流，我默默地走到五河县淮河大桥上，桥下是滚滚流淌浑浊的河水，不知道有多深。我想爬上栏杆，一头窜下去，一走了之。
大的形势的改变，你是无所适从。
是的，是的。
你的心里找不到一个落点。
真的，真是的。而且我有一个记日记的习惯，在这个时候我日记没办法记了。记什么呢？说什么呢？
人一下就迷失掉了。
对，方向没有了。
1978年末，多年未见的方中谋的弟弟方梅开突然找到张家。当时文革的平反工作正从中央到地方陆续展开，方梅开决定给姐姐申冤。他提出要一份当年的举报信，为姐姐写平反材料。然而张月生却拒绝了。不久，张宏斌父子读到了张志新的平反消息后，眼倦长叹。张宏斌也终于明白，原来这些年心底里不时冒出的自我怀疑并不反常。他对父亲说：“我们当年做错了。”
连天加夜的写，彻夜不眠。写呀，边写边哭，后悔呀。
就是认识到错了，承认错误这一步是很痛苦的。
是的。
因为这不是一个一般的错误，是一个没法挽回的生命。
是的。应该是用刀子切割心脏的那种疼。我和小姨母到了我家，我们娘两个抱头大哭。抱头大哭。当时窗外下着大雨，
母亲是张宏斌生命当中已经消失了近10年的一个词汇。方中谋死后，张家对此讳莫如深。张月生把和方中谋有关的照片、字迹全部通通都毁掉了。而近10年之后，当这个几乎被抹去的母亲重新回来的时候，所有的一切都强烈的冲击着张宏斌。白天他在工厂干活，晚上呢就通宵达旦的写。当年他写的是揭发材料，而这一次写的则是申诉和平反的材料。当年他写下的一切，把母亲钉上了十字架，而如今每一个曾经钉子一样砸在母亲身上的词句都反弹回来，好像是钉到了自己身上一样，锥心彻骨。张宏斌痛哭着写了近1个月，61页。他把初稿读给父亲听，父亲沉思了半晌，说：“我们当年的做法也有点不讲人道了。”
80年代。
You really get a sense that he's wrestling with what they did. And it's interesting that when his uncle his mother's brother, came to ask for a report so that he could start to apply for a rehabilitation, which would remove that classification from her. His father refused. He still, at that moment, believed that what they did was right, and maybe that was his coping mechanism that he had to do for his own sanity at that time. And they mentioned that there was a famous person who had been condemned that was rehabilitated, and it was later determined that her condemnation and execution were not just, not right, which I guess was the crack in him being able to reconsider what they had done. Anything else come to mind from the last segment we just watched?
Yeah, the woman, her name is Zhang Zhixin. So that is a very important case at that time, and to show that how Zhang Zhixin was a pious communist, but because he was not, she was concerned that Mao became a god figure, and
So sort of the same thing that his mom
right,
was saying,
right,
like where he's outgrown or become something other than true communist principles, and so
right. Yeah.
they still love communism, still love the Communist Party, but have a problem with Mao, which is the exact thing you can't do.
Right, right. And so, and that was because her case was overturned, and that gave people the hope so that their case can be overturned too. So there is a right after, I think it's about after that case, many people started to asking the government to overturn the sentence of, to can rehabilitate, what do you call that? Rehabilitate the reputation.
Sort of, yeah, rehabilitate the reputation. Was that done just for the purpose of reputation, or were there continuing to be implications where if you had a family member who had been classified, then it deprived you of opportunities, and so there's an incentive to get that overturned so that you no longer have that status on yourself?
That probably is a factor, but I think the more important is the sense of justice, because you've been wrongly accused. His mom really was not a counter-revolutionary. His mom was a pious communist. As a revolutionary as a revolution could be, but she was wrongly, accused and executed. So there is also that sense of justice that to kind of
it's kind of like if we were to imagine a relative that had been classified as somehow having betrayed America in the Cold War and Communist Revolution or something like that, or in the American Revolution, wanting to clear the name of your family or your loved one or something like that, just for a sense of pride and honor as well.
Right. Yeah.
And you mentioned, her piety as a communist, which such, they mentioned that she participated in the Yangtze River crossing campaign, which, if I recall correctly, was kind of like the Communist Party's final push that led to them having victory over the nationalists. And so, that would have been something that would have given her a position of honor or something to be proud about, but then to have all of that legacy wiped away by having been classified as a counter-revolutionary, it's understandable.
Right.
All right, well, let's keep going.
张宏斌考上了当地电大中文系。一天在上古代文学课的时候，他读到了明代散文家宋濂写的《原说》，如遭雷击。
有一种猿猴，猎人呢就把这个母亲捉到了，捉到以后把他扒了皮，小猴子看到他母亲这样下场，那就是反抗，那就是 抓、撞，最后这个小猴子也死了。他这篇文章最后说猴子猿猴尚且如此，何况人呢？所以我在看到这一篇文章的时候，我就在自己心里面骂自己：张宏斌啊，张宏斌，你畜生不如啊！动物还有亲情，还有母子之情，你呢？你有吗？犯下了滔天大罪，十恶不赦。没有想到他那时候的心情，现在没想到。我经常梦见母亲，有一天，母亲突然又出现在我的面前，我担心她会马上消失，我就拉着母亲的手，我哭着：“妈妈，你别走！”我拽住她的手，我在哭，我在向她诉说：“妈妈，我对不起你，儿子对不起你，真的对不起你啊！”可是妈妈不说话，一句话都没有说过。转眼又不见了。
这非常老的。
在给母亲方中某平反的过程中，有一件事一直深深地困扰着张宏斌。在他的印象里，母亲一直是一个热忱忠贞的革命者，始终积极要求进步。但为什么他在出事之前表现得越来越异常？为什么在1970年2月13日那个夜晚，他会突然歇斯底里，举止癫狂？
为什么？
在仔细翻阅了父亲、自己以及其他人的举报材料时，那些尘封的琐碎细节所揭示的真相，再次令张宏斌五雷轰顶，如梦方醒。1949年，23岁的方中谋受地下党父亲方雪梧的影响，加入了解放军。作为护士，参加了渡江战役，荣立2等功。但1年后，在家乡的土改运动中，父亲却被当作地主分子和匪特分子镇压。方中谋也受到牵连，被当作特务嫌疑内控对象。为了证明自己的革命忠诚，早日入党，他也曾向组织检举揭发过父亲，要求与地主家庭划清界限，不断改造思想。工作上更是积极拼命，并做到了固镇县医院门诊部副主任的职位。
I think this revelation is really particularly cutting, where you learn that in her own time when she was young, when her father was denounced and condemned, in order to preserve herself, she cut ties with him and denounced him.
Right.
And it just shows you that these systems of, ideology that they're using to completely reshape and force over their culture are breaking apart these family bonds that would otherwise hold true, putting people in impossible situations that cause them to take these actions. I think some people might say, well, that was just karma, that she ended up becoming victim of the same thing. But I think what we're learning from his story is that when people are put in these, systems that are so powerful with everybody around you holding on to these ideologies, they just put you in impossible situations, and people do what they can to survive, but escaping them can be so difficult.
Yeah.
Anything else pop out to you in that segment?
I think that's the way maybe that's what coming later. I think that the way she reacted that day, I think she was also feel sorry for what she did back then.
No. Okay,
yeah.
let's keep going.
1966年文革伊始，是张家人政治生命最荣耀的一年。方中谋的大女儿张芳被选为固镇县师生代表，参加了毛泽东第8次接见红卫兵。然而从北京回来不到1周，张芳就因为串联时传染了流脑而病发身亡。
母亲简直承受不住这个打击，遇到同事，她就哭啊，就说自己的好孩子张芳怎么好，怎么好，就像鲁迅先生笔下的祥林嫂。
据弟弟方梅开说，张芳死后
that they mention right there. So it can be hard to follow these names sometimes. Her daughter was elected to go and be received by Chairman Mao as a member of the Red Guard. And so she went. And one of the things that was happening was that there were epidemics of meningitis spreading through all these young people that were congregating there. So when she returned home, she fell sick and died of meningitis. And so to her mother, this is just another casualty in her life as a result of these communists and how they've disrupted her life, even though she's part of it. And that character that they mention where she's going around talking about her dead daughter all the time is a fictional character that had a bunch of really difficult things happening, including the death of the child. And they ended up destitute, just kind of walking around town, giving this story to anyone that would listen. Right.
就哭啊，就说自己的好孩子张芳怎么好，怎么好，就像鲁迅先生笔下的祥林嫂。
据弟弟方梅开说，张芳死后，方舟谋曾和他说：“为什么要搞文革？要让学生串联？如果学生们都在学校里好好上学，大胖也不会得这个病死了。”然而还没有从丧女的痛苦中走出来，夫妻2人又先后遭受冲击。丈夫张月生被戴上高帽批斗，在陪丈夫批斗的过程中，方中谋也挨过打。随后，方中谋再次受父亲牵连，被当作特务嫌疑关在县医院里隔离审查，限制人身自由。每天早晚在单位门口向人民群众低头认罪。1年多后，他被允许回家吃饭睡觉。这次回来之后，方舟谋的言行日渐怪异。1970年2月7日以来，思想上、精神上、情绪上不正常，如经常睡不着觉，几次提起已死的女儿张芳，哭哭啼啼；做家务时拿东忘西。他每天睡觉前有洗脸的习惯，有2晚洗了脸之后又洗1次。说话有些颠三倒四。炙热信仰的幻灭和残酷生活的双重打击，最终压垮了方中谋。事发前1晚，一直与父亲划清界限的方中谋突然说父亲是冤死的。事发当晚，方中谋和丈夫儿子争执起来，受到刺激的方中谋言行彻底失控。但由于身处特殊年代，又缺乏医学、心理学常识，方中谋激烈反常的言行被惊骇不已的父子俩完全当作了猖狂的反动行径，加以举报、揭发，并最终导致方中谋以反革命罪被枪决。
That's that part that you mentioned where she's reflecting on her own actions and the injustice of the death of her own father as a result of the same thing.
Yeah.
And you can see it seems like the death of her daughter really caused her to start to rethink things. And she's showing all the signs of an intense depression.
Right.
But they weren't able to see it as that because they had, that wasn't part of how they interpreted these actions, and her eventual lashing out was seen as anti-revolutionary crime rather than depression and everything else.
Right.
All right.
很多次，回到这地方，都非常沉重，不堪回首。它毕竟是我把我母亲亲手送上断头台的一个地方。哎，王姨你好，真是老邻居了啊！你和我母亲一样大。
您了解张律师的母亲吗？
还怪好的，还可以。那啥文化大革命都这里去那里去的，他妈都在那背着包上县院里去消毒啊，弄啥的都是他。这个院里都没人呢，都他自个在这个院里。
他出事了以后，你们是怎么想的？
我没看出来，就跟他这个大女儿，死过以后，我有点受刺激了。
这都还是田野嘛，过去都是这样的地，刑场就在前面。我母亲当时呢，从行车被押到这儿来，在这地方执行死刑，然后留下一滩血，大概就应该是在这边这个位置。
就在这儿。
对，就在这边这个位置。
这个地方。
是在这吗？
两个老分。
没有。在这了。母亲那个尸体怎么搞的？病过以后有个神经病。有个神经病就把他绑到他自己身上了，绑到自己身上就是乱跑。你把他分离了。
当时就是没有收，就直接就放在。
没人收，对。
2013年，一篇名为《一个文革逆子的忏悔》的文章引起巨大热议，作者正是张hongbing。这段腐骨蚀心的个人史，张hongbing原本打算隐藏起来，但一天他在网上看到“文化大革命就是好，再搞一次文革”等言论，再也无法沉默了。在文中，他像当年做大义灭亲报告一样，详细描述了1970年那个残酷夜晚所发生的一切。
我愿意做一个反面教员，我把我家庭里面发生的这件惨绝人寰的惨剧展现给世人来看，把这一块血淋淋的伤疤揭开来给人看，让大家思考为什么在这个家庭里会产生这样的人间悲剧，怎样才能避免这个悲剧重演？
张hongbing的忏悔录一经发布，掀起了轩然大波。很多人们无法理解，用最恶毒的字眼诅咒他、谩骂他。张hongbing对此毫不辩驳，他觉得这些责骂并不能抵消他对母亲犯下的罪行。
有的人会说，因为他是这个时代造成的，并不是自己造成的。
从责任来说，社会的归社会，家庭的归家庭，个人的归个人。
我并没有打算放过自己。
没有，是的，我没打算放过自己。我是应该背上这个沉重的十字架。这个十字架，它并不因为我现在公开的说出这件事情它就消失了，它将永远由我肩负着，一步一步的往前走，一直到我走进坟墓的那一天。
在1993年的日记里，张hongbing呢曾经写了这样一件事。有一天，父亲提到一位老同事曾经说：“你和老方结婚10多年，不应该报案。”张月生回答他：“方仲谋在家能说，到外面也能说。如果在外面说了，就会连累我们一家。不办他就办你。当时的政治形势摆在那儿。”末了，他还对张hongbing说：“你母亲是个好人。”这是母亲去世20多年来父亲鲜少提及的母亲之死。 但是张宏斌认为，即便当年父亲不举报，他也会去的。正是自己的狂热坚决，把父亲也逼到了那一步。2003年父亲去世，张宏斌则不断地扪心自问：从小他就是一个听话的好孩子，天性并不坏，为什么就会把母亲推上绝路呢？究竟是什么让自己丧失了最基本的人性和亲情？而母亲究竟是带着一种怎样的心情赴死？究竟怎样看待这母子一场？究竟有没有原谅他呢？这些问题，他终其一生也不会找到答案了。轰轰烈烈、灼烧一切的大时代早已经过去，可是张宏斌却不想和过去和解。他一次次走着母亲赴死的那条道路，一次次的感受母亲最后的时刻。他说，也许只有疼痛才能让他觉得没有忘记母亲，也只有这种自我折磨，才能让自己为母亲的死亡付上一点点代价。
1951年，我父亲和母亲结婚时候买的皮箱，当时是一对。这条围巾是我母亲围过的。
哦，你母亲围过的？
我母亲围过的围巾，这一条羊毛围巾。这个呢，就是我母亲在隔离审查的时候用的茶缸和这个勺子，搪瓷的缸盖子。然后这是我家里面的买粮食的，当时上粮站买粮食的面口袋，这上面的补丁都是我母亲补，这样补的阵脚很密。有时候在想，如果当年我不做这件蠢事，母亲活到现在也才80多岁，他健在的话，你看到我们这一家大人孩子，心里该多高兴。
All right. Well, we made it to the end. It's a heart-wrenching story when you see how the system that they lived in really had its way with their family. I think at the end where his father's saying, we had to put her away because if we didn't, she was starting to talk more and more publicly, and eventually they would have come for the entire family.
Right.
And who knows if that's true or not, but those are the types of fears that then drive people's actions and get weighed in the calculation, especially when you don't have any idea how far the crowd will go. What are any final thoughts at the end of all of this?
Yeah, it is really hard to imagine how the father felt at that time, because they loved each other, so they got married, right? And we know that the feeling of they had that, and then they have 3 kids, and they have so many together. And when the father was being struggled, and the mother helped him, so it's very hard to to really understand. But one thing, as a father, I think when he think about his children, that is something also very very real, because if he hadn't report on her and she would. I mean, she had been doing something kind of, out of irrational. I mean, because the depression or something. I mean, she was under that kind of stress. So she's actually doing something she are not supposed to do, even though she not happy with Mao, but she in the right how to say, sometimes words is not cannot do justice, right? So if she is rational at the time, she won't do that, but she definitely did something. Like she actually took out and Mao's portrait and burned it. I mean, that's a big deal at that time. I mean, that is just by that alone, you would be sentenced to that. And so I think that the concern definitely is real for the father. And if he didn't report on her, then somebody else will report. Then the whole family will be, in trouble. And not only he might also being executed, but all the children will have that burden of parents are counter-revolutionaries. So in a way, yeah, it's really 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 hard.
I think it's very easy for us to sit in our current place,
right.
Look back at them and judge them and say, no one would ever do that. There must be something, fundamentally wrong with these people for have them make those choices. But you just have to understand how powerful all of those social forces were that they inhabited. And for me, I think the real powerful part of this story is the questions that he asks at the end,
right.
where he starts to see that there are people saying, hey, the Cultural Revolution, we should do that again. Or there's not, it's not that bad. And around this time, there were photographs of students in the universities in China who had learned about the history of the Cultural Revolution and started dressing up as Red Guards, kind of as a joke, but making light of something that all of these people who are now in their 60s look back on with horror. Horror because of the realities that existed, but also because they themselves took part in it. And it's a dark part of their own souls that they have yet to reconcile.
Yeah, and also right now, she is trying to be Mao the Second, and a lot of things China has been doing remind people of that era.
The next thing that he says, where he wants his story to be a negative example, in that he's not asking for forgiveness. And this is a consistent thread in all the different articles and interviews. He's not asking for forgiveness. He wants, and he does, condemn himself completely and wholly. And he wants the negative example of his life to warn people about what happens when you start taking these ideologies that are totalistic. They place the values of the ideology as higher than any other value. It's more important than your family. It's more important than your church. It's more important than anything else. And the thing that you really have to keep in mind is there's this concept that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. And what that means is you can take the different aspects of how these ideologies interact with group and human individual psychology. And if you start seeing similarities in ways of thinking that are becoming more prominent today, then you just need to realize that the rhyming part of how history repeats itself means that we could find ourselves in those extremes once again, where people feel like it's right to denounce family members in favor of a certain way of thinking. And do it with such emphatic zeal that they have no difficulty condemning or cutting ties with them.
Right. You talk about the rhymes. I like that. The history does not necessarily repeat, so it's not exactly the same, but definitely rhymes. And that's actually why many Chinese Americans who grew up during the Cultural Revolution are speaking out against the CRT, the critical race theory, and what they are doing in America's K-12 education. it's basically, it's a remind me, we see the parallels. In a way, we see the rhyme, because now that ideology is basically look people in terms of race. So if you are white, then you are bad. It doesn't matter. I mean, it doesn't matter you came from, has nothing to do with slavery. It doesn't matter you came to America as a poor Irish kid. I mean, as long as you're white, I mean, you bear the sin of the past. So that just reminds us exactly what happened in during the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, I've heard people describe that as the way that critical race theory is manifesting in society and in these ideologically driven ways has been described as race Marxism, where you just take the same conflict theory that Marx set up based on classes, and instead of stratifying society by class, you stratify them by race. And then all of the same conflicts, all of the same arguments, all of the same social levers that get pulled in terms of condemning other people and looking at every issue through that issue, through that lens, it will pervade society, and they're just starting to see that same thing again. It's that concept of it rhyming. It's not exactly the same, but in many cases, the social levers, the psychological levers that get pulled, the ways that mob action take place, particularly magnified by social media, it's all coming to a head.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
I'm very.
Yeah, you could say something in the past, which was not a problem back then, but 30 and 40 years later, I mean, those things, they can dig it up and use that against you. And this is really what happened during the Cultural Revolution. I mean, anything you said can be used against you, which is totally out of context. And this is what, actually, I wrote a article. The name is the Undeclared Cultural Revolution in America. So right now we actually are in a cultural revolution. It's just never declared. So most people don't know it, but we are living in it right now.
Yeah, I think there's some important ways that it can sneak up on you. And I mean, the first one is that there's no one figure of Mao that's driving it. It's more of a social movement that doesn't have any one particular figurehead, which makes it harder to nail down. And then because it is, it's really relying on our own sense of empathy and justice in order to make its arguments, then it's harder to push back against, because you end up, people equate, if you say, well, that's not how we need to address the real problem of racism. If somebody tries to, for example, say that this way of anti-racism isn't the best way, and there are other ways of addressing the real problem of racism, then they'll say, well, if you're against anti-racism, that means you are a racist. And so there's a lot of that same fear that people have, particularly because a lot of this is being driven by, again, young ideological people who've been educated in our universities with this particular way of thinking. And it's included the same thing where if anyone thinks differently, then they are bad people. And so then you have stories then of family members denouncing their family at Thanksgiving because they're complicit in systems of oppression, because they won't fess up to their privilege and their whiteness, and just like the same sort of rhyming pattern of when an ideology takes over everything.
Yeah, and also it's dehumanizing. So therefore, just like Zhang Hongbing, the gentleman in the story, at that moment, her mom became a monster. And that's the ideology which can dehumanizing people. So you don't look people as people, you look at them as something, in his case, is a class enemy. But now, if you look through the lens of the CRT, then you also become, you are bad people, right? If you are bad people, therefore, we can do things to you, and it become justified to doing all kind of, destructions, riots, and all things in the name of, those kind
justice.
of, yeah.
So I think you know, and it's not just critical race theory. There's all these different ways of looking at the world that end up dividing people into classes and then pitting them against each other, which have the same effects. So, you know, the take-home lesson from this, what are the red flags of these ways of thinking? And I think you've named a few of them. If there's anything that leads you to dehumanize other people, if there's anything that leads you to split people or institutions or anything into all good or all bad, if there's any system of thought that tells you that its values and its priorities are higher than any other value and priority, even to the point of betraying family members. All of these things are red flags. When you start to hear them, you know, justifying violence against one particular class of people that you've divided along some ideological lines in the name of a greater good, you know, all these different things are red flags. And when you're in your groups and you're talking about these things, when you're on your social media, in your discussion forums, and people start repeating these slogans or telling that you can't say or think any other way other than this groupthink sort of way, you just have to step back and say, wait a second, am I falling into one of these ideological, you know, traps, these voids that will end up leading me to take actions that I may later regret because they're driven by this groupthink, as this family's example showed to devastating effect.
Right, exactly.
All right. Well, I think we got to wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, really.
You added such great depth for this.
Yeah, and also kind of, even though it's painful for me, but I think it's good to really reflect on this, to go through it in a way to help us not to repeat. And I think that's the reflection for us who has been through it, needs to think, you know, to think as deep as we can and to learn something from it so that it won't get repeated. And I was so surprised, and when she became the leader and she became more like Mao, and he got away with it. That's part I just still trying to figure it out, because people like us, like me, we went through that. There's so many Chinese who lived through that, and they just allowed Xi to become the second Mao, which I mean, kind of unbelievable, but that's what's happening. Which tell me that most of the Chinese who actually lived through it, probably didn't learn the lesson from it.
The other fear is that the technical capabilities of the political forces in power now have so much more ability to monitor and to, you know, if you don't have the protections of civil liberties and things like the Bill of Rights, then it just allows them a much wider tool set to stay in power, to maintain power, and to suppress dissent.
Yeah.
All right. Well, until next time, I think there's still a few other stories. If I can get you to come back and give us your insight on, we'll do that again. And I want to invite all the viewers. There's a great interview between you and Lily for Liberty.
Right. Yeah.
And I'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can check it out. It's a great discussion. Again, if you guys can go out and search for these Chinese immigrants who lived through the Cultural Revolution, who are here in America and are starting to speak up about the rhyming parallels between that chapter of history and what we're seeing now in America. It's really important to look at their perspective and be able to compare what's happening with what they're telling us about and what they're warning about. All right. Well, until next time, thank you so much, Dr. Ping, for joining us. And this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.
Okay.
Bye now.
Thank you.